Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. We'll begin in just a few moments. Just give people a minute to actually get connected. Okay, I see people are still coming in, but I think we can go ahead and get started with our introductions. So, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this presentation. I'm Lorna Quant. I'm faculty here at Gallaudet University. I'm not going to introduce our lecturer for today, but I will bring up our student momentarily who will actually formally do our introduction for our presenter. Before we begin that, I just want to make sure everyone knows that you can use the chat box in Zoom to make comments or discussion during the presentation. Also, you can use the Q&A box for any questions that you want to have discussed with Dr. Menon at the end of the presentation. If you want to ensure that he sees your question or your comment, go ahead and use the Q&A box for that function. A link has also been posted to our captions. So if you'd like to watch the captions in a separate screen, you can go ahead and click on that link. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our Penn 701 student to introduce our speaker, Sarah Kadar. Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah. I'm a linguistics student here at Gallaudet University taking a Penn class. I want to welcome you all to the PhD in Educational Neuroscience Distinguished Lecture hosted by Gallaudet University. This lecture series aims to honor world-renowned scientists in the fields of psychology, education, cognitive sciences, and neuroscience, and many more. These different fields and all of the interdisciplinary fields in between contribute to a new and growing field of educational neuroscience. They increase our understanding of the human mind and the neural mechanisms of learning. This year's Distinguished Lecture Series theme is From Brain Development to Developing Virtual Brains. I'm honored to introduce our distinguished lecturer for today, Dr. Vinod Menon. He's director of the Stanford Cognitive and Systems Neuroscience Laboratory. His lab seeks to advance fundamental knowledge of the human brain function and dysfunction, and to use this knowledge to help children and adults with psychiatric and neurologic disorders. His research has led to major breakthroughs in our understanding of the architecture, function, and development of the large-scale distributed human-brain networks. His work has resulted in a paradigm shift in how we investigate brain function and cognition. Dr. Menon's research has been cited over 69,000 times, and he's been recognized multiple times as an ISI highly cited researcher with cross-field impact. He was also recognized by the NIH with a Merit Award for Outstanding Research. Today's presentation is entitled Systems Neuroscience Models of Numerical Cognition and Learning Disabilities. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Menon.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Sarah. Very well put. So to Dr. Ilaria Bartoletti for inviting me. It's really a great honor and pleasure to be with you discussing some of our work, which has strong ties not only to understanding brain circuitry, but I believe to educational neuroscience and how we could develop better interventions and monitor them through advanced brain imaging models, and then circle back to informing cognitive theories. So I just want to make sure that you're able to follow the pace, and if not, just let me know, and I will either hasten or slow down. Okay, so hopefully you're all able to see my slides at this point. And so I'm at Stanford University, where we are conducting multidisciplinary research in the area of learning disabilities with a primary focus on dyscalculia. So at the very outset, I want to acknowledge my collaborators here who have contributed immensely to our work. And I will highlight their studies as I go along. Also want to acknowledge funding from the NIH and the NSF. So I will let you peruse the slide for about 20 seconds, and then I'll come back to outlining the organization of my talk. The first part, I'm going to focus on brain organization for numerical cognition, which is the focus of today's presentation. I'll highlight the multiple cognitive processes that are involved, the multiple brain circuits, and also then link back to sources of deficits and dysfunctional circuits in children with dyscalculia. The next part will focus on neurodevelopmental changes and how we tracked trajectories and made discoveries about the changing role of the prefrontal cortex and medial temporal lobe, and how representations and processing shifts from these memory encoding and association forming areas and prefrontal areas, which are involved in very complex decision-making and working memory, to more automated processing, which relies on posterior brain areas. And then I'll focus on the development of memory-based problem-solving strategies, where we assess individual differences in strategy use, building on the work of Bob Sigler and this model of waves of skill acquisition, and show and illustrate the crucial role of the memory, the medial temporal lobe memory system. And that sets the basis for the study of learning and brain plasticity and investigations of sources of individual differences. And then I will conclude with a statement of broader relevance for educational neuroscience. So we all know that childhood is a critical period for learning. And children acquire an astounding number of cognitive skills through language and numeracy. And these set the foundations for an entire slew of cognitive development that occurs later. So language skills occurring somewhat earlier in its complexity than numerical cognition, but the underlying principles are really quite similar, as I believe they engage in very similar kinds of brain circuits for skill acquisition. And that's, although the underlying infrastructure is somewhat different, the learning process is actually quite similar in terms of the machinery that the brain has to build to learn and build those skills. That then, these are good paradigmatic models, the reading and math domains, but there's every reason to believe that these processes also extend to other types of learning. And then we know that these skills are really important to study at an early age because they influence all kinds of subsequent academic performance, professional success, and even mental health. So learning disabilities are widespread and persistent. So this is just to state things that we have known broadly for a number of years, but just to kind of hone in the significance of this line of work. Learning disabilities, including dyscalculia and dyslexia, impact 5 to 20% of children, depending on how you assess this, often goes undiagnosed, particularly in developing countries. There's far-reaching consequences, not only for academic success, but the motivation to learn as well. And the costs are really staggering, over 100 billion a year in the US alone. So you can imagine that scaling up multiple times across the globe. And we know that learning disabilities have neurobiological origins that we're able to probe and understand quite well at this point, although a number of details are still being worked through despite decades of progress. Now, one of the challenges here is that these disorders are often heterogeneous and co-occurring. And so the challenge is to tease domain-specific learning disabilities from more broad and general learning disabilities, and also ADHD, which, as you might imagine, due to a lack of focused attention and the appropriate use of cognitive control machinery, can impact all subsequent learning. The manifestations of these are quite broad across both the domains of learning disabilities and clinical psychopathological cases. So in the domain of dyscalculia, math learning disabilities, which I'll use somewhat interchangeably here, the deficits in number sense and fluency of arithmetic problem solving are the key foundational deficits. It affects about 10 to 20% of individuals. 3 to 6% are severely dyscalculic, which generally means that they have significant foundational number sense deficits, which then cascades into deficits in fluency. And this is often comorbid with other cognitive deficits, including working memory deficits, language abilities, attention, and executive functions. And in the US, this is a widespread issue for a number of different reasons, which we can get to later in the context of the broader implications of this work, and also any questions you may have. We do know that the US generally performs at the lower end of international tests of math literacy. And the question is, what what can we learn from and scaffold from educational neuroscience studies, and of course, the work that's going on in other countries behaviorally and cognitively. And in this domain too, there are, the costs are staggering in the US alone. And these skills do matter. And in general, deficits in math skills have a strong implication for future success. A number of different case studies have shown difficulties with making very basic judgments in relation to financial aspects as well as healthcare. And studies have shown that, and the OECD report suggested that improving math skills by just 0.5 standard deviation can raise GDP by 0.87%. So there's lots of reasons to kind of understand this domain well and use it also as a model system for the study of learning disabilities. So I'm going to focus on this aspect next that I alluded to, which is some basic and foundational information about the kind of cognitive processes that we study in this domain, the brain circuits, and also give you a nice glaring example of how a systems approach to understanding circuitry can inform the study of dyscalculia and learning disabilities. So numerical cognition, as most other cognitive processes of all sorts, relies on a distributed network of brain areas. And in this case, I've actually highlighted the core systems that are involved, which are labeled here by color. So you have this early visual processing and categorization pathways. You have to recognize the form of a symbol or a set of dots. You have to attend to it in space, which is the role of the parietal system, particularly the IPS, the intraparietal sulcus, and the adjoining superior parietal lobule. And then you have a whole cognitive control machinery. I've split this into two parts, like a ventral attentional control system and a working memory system. And these are engaged when the task is less automated and new learning has to occur. But once new information is learned, then the representations are not dependent on prefrontal cortex except to retrieve and make decisions in appropriate context. And then newer studies are showing the role and the critical role of the memory system anchored in the medial temporal lobe, as well as the anterior temporal lobe, which encodes for semantic memories. And what we and others have done over the last decade or so is to try and unpack the circuitry, the type of processing that occurs, what happens during normal development, what happens during learning, and to use that to understand how problem solving in this domain is impacted in individuals with learning disabilities. So over the years, this is somewhat an older study showing meta-analysis of multiple studies illustrating that these core areas, which I would call dorsal visual stream and the ventral visual stream, here anchored in the IPS on the dorsal side, on the ventral side in the inferior temporal cortex or ventrotemporal occipital cortex, and the adjoining fusiform gyrus, and this whole frontoinsular parietal working memory and control buffer. So you have to recognize visual objects, you have to encode them in with an attentional system, spatial attentional system, and you have to engage the appropriate cognitive machinery to form, during the learning stages, appropriate binding of representations. But during an overlearned stage, which is where most of the studies have been in adults and children, the kinds of neurodevelopmental changes that occur with age and with proficiency. So it's really important to understand that there's no one key locus for numerical and related cognition and problem solving. There's a lot of overlap in the circuitry between these two domains themselves, but also with working memory and visuospatial attention. So the importance of that is that the brain actually scaffolds very elementary processing systems to build new knowledge representations. And that's a key organizing principle of the way we view knowledge acquisition and learning and development. You can see the very consistent patterns of overlap across these, and depending on the task load, the responses might be more extensive or less extensive. So this is just to illustrate that this understanding these parts of global circuits across the brain can help you understand what might be dysfunctional in children with learning disabilities. So in this study, we looked at resting state fMRI, and we looked at one of the core areas that has been implicated in numerical cognition in neurotypical adults, as well as a putative source of deficits in individuals with dyscalculia learning disabilities, the intraparietal sulcus. And we look at the global connectivity of that region across multiple areas. And what we found surprisingly was that there was an intrinsic pattern of hyperconnectivity across a number of brain areas, kind of highlighted here, and the overlap between the left and right is shown in green. And that you can actually use these patterns to classify individuals as belonging to the neurotypical control group or the child group with learning disabilities with a very high level of accuracy. And my own thinking is that this hyperconnectivity actually prevents appropriate task-related modulation of regions and circuits. And that's one of the organizing principles of learning deficits. And more broadly, it actually ties into this notion of EI imbalance as perhaps a foundational deficit for a number of neurodevelopmental disorders. And this just shows that you can do that in a categorical sense that I showed you in the previous slide, but also in a dimensional sense, the IPS circuitry with a number of different brain areas is actually related to individual differences in math abilities. And it's really hyperconnectivity at the lower end of the performance. So the other thing we showed in this study, and it's related to this whole idea of hyperconnectivity, is enhanced low amplitude fluctuations. So in this analysis, if you're not familiar with, you look at the amplitude of responses and you compute basically an RMS and you scale it with frequencies of interest versus frequencies that are not of interest. And you see that the level of signal fluctuations is actually enhanced in children with MD. And this actually has been replicated in another study very recently by my former postdoc, who's now at Rutgers, Miriam Rosenberg-Lee, with a completely different cohort. So we think this is a very robust effect. And it's also, the hints of this have also been seen in reading disabilities in different areas, obviously. So, so these core parietal areas, which have been implicated, as well as the hippocampal formation, show enhanced fluctuations. So you can imagine that if these fluctuations are enhanced, they will not respond to external stimuli in an appropriate way. And so this gives us some foundational knowledge of the underlying circuitry or potential neural mechanisms related to EI imbalance, which may be the source of, the grand source of a lot of the deficits that we see. So this just summarizes. I'll let you read through it for a few seconds. So the upshot really is what I was just saying before, that there is hyperfluctuations, there's hyperconnectivity of the IPS, which we think is a key underlying factor in dyscalculia, and that all the subsequent effects in terms of the processing and learning are perhaps constrained by this underlying neurophysiological feature. And we've seen also that, and I've used this example to illustrate that MLD is not a deficit of one particular brain area, but rather it involves network level deficits. So we've considered some basic aspects of organization and circuitry and shown that distributed circuits are involved and they distinguish children with dyscalculia from controls. So now I'm going to move to some of our neurodevelopmental studies, starting from our older ones, because they lay some of the foundations for understanding what happens in relation to strategy use and cognitive training. So in this study, the main thing I want you to take away is that there is a shift in brain activity from the frontal lobe to these parietal and ventral temporal areas with age. So processing is not so longer dependent on prefrontal cortex functions and decision-making and working memory. So this is I forgot to mention, this is during a very simple single and double operand addition and subtraction problems. So we're moving to task-based analyses here with, A plus B equals C, or is it correct or not? That's the judgment that participants have to make, or A plus B plus C equals D, so that we could modulate the task difficulty. And this just shows and illustrates the key points that I was trying to make, and some of the features of this shift from the prefrontal cortex to these parietal and ventral stream. But also, surprisingly, it gave us the first hints that the hippocampus actually plays a role at an early age, because it's active in younger children and then decreases with age. And so the message from a wide range of studies, which I'll try to highlight as I go along, is that some of the things we see in adults appear very differently when you look at children. And we think that the medial temporal lobe is one of those areas that is engaged in scaffolding and learning of new information through its essential role in binding and creating new cognitive representations. And that's a very hot area of research in all kinds of fields, not just learning and memory, but also building machine learning tools that involve binding or semantic information. So, so this study gave us an initial hint of the role of the medial temporal lobe and this shift, but that's not sufficient. It doesn't really tell us much about what are the factors and changes in cognitive strategy use that leads to those developmental changes. And so that's the next set of studies that I want to highlight here. So it's very well known from the work of Siegler and Gary and a number of other people that with the development of skills in this domain of numerical problem solving, where you start initially with very inefficient strategies like counting or verbalizing, and then move to more memory-based decomposition and retrieval strategies. And eventually it's become so fluid that you're able to recall 2 + 3 is 5 without having to count or with your fingers or verbally. But so it's really important to pay attention to this cascade of events that occurs if you want to understand both how learning occurs and how circuitry changes with development in age and learning. So there's a kind of canonical task that we have others have used over the years. I just want to highlight some key findings. The pattern essentially is remarkably similar, and the tasks are actually quite similar. The novel aspects of this study were the assessment of strategy use. So we probed strategy use using the work of prior work of Dave Geary and others, and we could assess on what fraction of the trials the participant actually uses finger counting or verbalizes the problem solving or is able to recall immediately. And so we've done a number of studies validating this, building on Dave Geary's work, and we've used a number of tools now to assay what happens in relation to changes in strategy use. And so this is more fine-grained analysis compared to saying, you know, what happens with age, which we kind of worked out several years back. So the effects are actually quite remarkable, and this is also proof that our approach actually works, in the sense that retrieval strategy use is associated with a dramatic drop in reaction time on problem solving. In fact, in this age group, it's as much as 2.5 seconds. And this just shows that it exists not only in a dichotomous retrieval and counting, but if you assess the ratio of retrieval use, you see this kind of very similar and robust pattern of decrease in problem-solving time with retrieval strategy use. So then we looked at, you know, what happens to the brain in relation to retrieval fluency. So this is a very tight group of second and third graders, so that we're not looking across a very wide developmental age range. And so what we find is that, and what really struck us, was that the medial temporal lobe, which hadn't really been a player in studies of numerical cognition and arithmetic problem solving in adults, really popped up in a very strong way. So this region, both the hippocampus, mainly the hippocampus here, but somewhat also the parahippocampal gyrus, shows this increased response in relation to retrieval fluency. And moreover, the connectivity of the hippocampus with a number of different prefrontal control areas, as well as the insula, shows a very significant increase with retrieval fluency. This is not resting state connectivity. This is actually task modulated connectivity in correspondence to a control condition. So this gave us the hints that this region is really involved in a specific use of retrieval strategy use, and its circuitry with prefrontal cortex is also implicated. It's not just one region that's coding the underlying retrieval. And we've used decoding techniques, in this case, a searchlight algorithm, which you might be familiar with. We look at, instead of looking at overall response, we say how multivariate patterns distinct in these regions, and we find that, again, in the hippocampus, with a very high decoding rate, those who are retrievers versus counters show very distinct patterns of of response profiles. So both univariate, that is individual voxel level, and the distributed patterns within these areas show very distinct responses in retrievers. So this just summarizes what I just said. There's higher recruitment of the hippocampus and prefrontal areas with retrieval use. So this is, again, I want to highlight that the prefrontal cortex actually plays multiple roles during development, during the process of when you're learning to bind new information. It's really critically involved. It decays away and then comes back when the problem solving is more complex. So so all these things have to be viewed in the context of both individual proficiency and strategy use, as well as the stage of development. And then the hippocampal prefrontal circuitry is involved, as you know, from a wide range of studies in humans and rodents. So there's the prefrontal cortex plays an essential role in control of recall processes, which are really very prominent as recall is not highly automated during the stage of development. And we've gone to study other aspects of the signaling between these areas, but the upshot is that hippocampal prefrontal circuits play an essential role in early development of arithmetic retrieval fluency. And this is just showing you the hippocampus key area, which is involved in learning and memory, but surprisingly missing from most studies of learning and memory in all kinds of learning disabilities, including reading disabilities and math disabilities. So again, the upshot is that is using this core machinery to learn new information. And this is true both in a episodic learning task that occurs in a Psych 101 setting to actual real world learning. So we've probed this with the next phase of studies using a longitudinal analysis of change, and also contrasting that longitudinal change with what we had seen earlier with in adolescence and adulthood. So this is a key theoretical notion from a wide body of developmental work. And this occurs in multiple domains. And actually, numerical cognition provides a very nice specific domain to study this, in the sense that strategy use, which is coded here with different lines, they have different ratios of occurrence at different stages. During the early stages, the counting, finger counting is prominent. Then it shifts to more mixed strategy, and its occurrence changes over time. And then retrieval starts to take off at some point. And eventually, when you're proficient, you just recall the fact. So this is the design of the study, a longitudinal study where we brought the kids back after one and a half years or so. And then we also compared our findings with these canonical tasks with assessments of strategy use at each time point, both in kids and adults. This is the cohort, just to give you a sense of the age and what they really matched on. Actually, in our samples, we tried to control for word reading, so we weren't really able to assess any heterogeneities in relation to reading disabilities. So this shows you data from the longitudinal sample, both accuracy and reaction time. You can see how dramatically the reaction time starts to fall even within the space of a year and 1.2 years, and it continues and then starts to saturate after adolescence. And the same you see for accuracy as well, big, less of a change in accuracy, but very dramatic after into adolescence. So this just shows in this kind of longitudinal sample, we're able to replicate this response of during problem solving in not just these canonical parietal and prefrontal areas, but also in the hippocampus. Now, this is the interesting finding. So we look at the hippocampus and we see that the responses in both the left and right, they go up over 1.2 year time period. And we look at the anatomical region, a larger area than that functional cluster. And you see here too, this very large increase in signal over a period of 1.2 years. And again, recapitulating the cross-sectional studies, the longitudinal studies also show changes now assessed at the individual subject level effects over a period of 1.2 years. Hippocampal, and this is again task-related connectivity using a technique called GPPI, which addresses task-related modulation and functional connectivity. And that goes up in relation to retrieval fluency. So during the formation of these retrieval strategies, these areas are all talking to each other to form new representations. And that's proportional, the engagement is proportional to how effectively a child is able to use retrieval strategies. Now, here's the dramatic result, actually. So I told you that as we go from over this 1.2 year longitudinal period, the hippocampal response goes up. But in adolescence, they're doing the same problem solving, the hippocampal response is just completely gone. So this is a system that actually scaffolds learning and knowledge acquisition, and it's not engaged. And that's what we see in most adult studies. You don't see strong responses unless it's a learning context or some new binding information is taking place. And then in parallel with that, we see longitudinal decrease in frontoparietal engagement because you don't have to sustain that information in working memory because you have more efficient problem solving strategies. And this just basically summarizes the kinds of effects that I've described to you. So this increase over a short period of very active learning in the domain, and then there's not that much engagement later. And we see that in the anatomically defined ROIs across the whole hippocampus as well. So this is a system, we believe, that scaffolds learning of new information in this domain. So the hippocampus is not engaged in adults. So what happens to that information? And so we did something called a trial by trial stability analysis. And what it shows is that although the hippocampus is not engaged as much in adolescents and adults, in the slides I showed you earlier, it has, if you look at the underlying pattern representations, it actually becomes much more stable with age. So there's still manifest representations that are being stored in the medial temporal lobe that the system can actually access as needed. If it wasn't, we wouldn't see this profile. And it's consistent with a whole range of optogenetic studies in rodents where you can actually trigger new memories by exciting particular cell assemblies. So the model that we are working with in the context of learning in this domain and also related to developmental changes is that you form efficient problem-solving strategies by engaging prefrontal cortical modules with the medial temporal lobe. And then once those memories related to fact retrieval are consolidated, then they engage cortical modules for problem solving and are independent of the medial temporal lobe. So this is important because you have to think about the essential ingredients of learning during the early phases. You have to think of paradigms where the medial temporal lobe functions and all the things we've learned about the medial temporal lobe are involved in building representations. And so this just recapitulates what I just said, that the hippocampal system plays a pivotal role in strategic transition from procedure-based and inefficient problem solving to memory-based problem solving, which then frees up the prefrontal cortex for more complex functions. And so the skills can then build upon themselves in a hierarchical fashion. So at each stage of learning, you're using previously learned representations to acquire new knowledge. And that's what numerical cognition is more broadly as development and new types of learning occur. They're much more difficult to investigate. And they illustrate the dynamic role of the hippocampus in learning. So now we're back to this kind of model circuit with the key role of these frontoparietal systems during the early stages of learning. The medial temporal lobe, which is engaged during the formation of those binding of representations, the stimulus to an answer, or 5 dots to the symbol 5, and so on. And I think that's a fundamental architecture for learning new information. And this architecture is quite different from what we see in adults who have overlearned representations. Okay, so now I'm going to shift to the final part of the talk, which deals with training and neural plasticity. We've been conducting a number of different studies. And I've just have time to highlight a couple of them. And so what are the neural mechanisms that drive some children to acquire math skills better than others? What is the role of the medial temporal lobe? What's the role of the parietal cortex? And can tutoring remediate behavioral performance and alter these circuits that I've been describing in children with MD, MLD? So in this study, we examined neural predictors of individual response to math tutoring in primary grade school children. And we looked for quantitative changes, measures of brain structure and intrinsic functional connectivity, which would potentially provide a better and more sensitive marker of skill acquisition than neuropsychological assessment measures. So we've conducted a number of different studies with this paradigm with an 8-week training protocol. Our subject sizes for various studies have varied between 24 and 35. And so there's initial assessments, a pre-scan with the rest stage structural and math tasks. I'll describe the results. 4 lessons trained on basic number properties to build appropriate representations that can be scaffolded for improved counting strategies. and then the problems become progressively harder. And then there's a review session and a subsequent scan. So one of the earlier studies we looked at was what are the predictors of learning, and does the hippocampal memory system play a key role in it? Here's just data showing that the tutoring works in terms of increasing accuracy and decreasing reaction time. So one of the questions is, does training study, and of what sort and what type and what duration, recapitulate what we see in normal development as a way of pushing the envelope on better manipulation and control over what happens during a period of 8 weeks compared to years where you have no control over what kinds of things happen. So one of the things that surprised us was that the structure of the hippocampus is actually a very strong predictor of performance gains. So these are gains with the training session that I described, and here's the gray matter volume. I should tell you that we just have a paper that we've submitted where we looked at abacus training in collaboration with a group in China. And we see very similar effects. The long-term training gains in abacus training are also predicted more by the hippocampus than any other region. So, and then we look at intrinsic functional connectivity. And we seed the hippocampus, and we find that there are a number of areas, these are the target areas, with which the hippocampal functional connectivity also predicts gains. So keeping with the same theme that there's a broad circuitry that involves the prefrontal cortex, and surprisingly less so the parietal cortex in this study, as being a predictor of gains. So how the prefrontal control system circuitry is built to interact with the medial temporal lobe is one of the strongest predictors of gains in response to tutoring. And this just compares some other areas, and surprisingly, the IPS just showed up at the bottom of the list, and the hippocampus was one of the strongest in terms of predicting gains. So tying in this to the developmental results I showed you earlier, it suggests that what happens during normal development can be studied and probed much more rigorously with these training paradigms. Just recapitulating the points that I mentioned, that actually this is that the hippocampal circuitry is strongly related to predicting gains, and it captures aspects of development in a very short period of time. So the next study we did was to look at children with learning disabilities. And what we showed in this study, published a few years back, was that cognitive tutoring induces widespread neuroplasticity, and that then results in remediation of aberrant brain responses in children with learning disabilities. So here's the sample with the same training protocol. We try to match on as many things as possible, but they obviously differ by definition in these core math measures from the Y2. So the first thing was to just make sure that the training actually helps children with MLD, and in fact, there's a large gain that occurs pre to post tutoring. This is again the same kind of arithmetic problem solving task that I showed you earlier. So here's what happens, in terms of the plasticity changes. So we see this overactive responses during the pre-training phase, which is suppressed in the post, and no brain area actually shows greater response during the post compared to the pre. And we've looked at this from many different ways. This is just another recap of it in comparison to the control group. So pre-tutoring, you see significant differences in a number of brain areas in children with MLD, and post-training, there's no difference. Now we've developed, decoding methods to look at this. So this is just saying that if you put all the voxels or most of the voxels that are involved in the task into this decoding algorithm, pre-training, there's a very high differentiation between the MLD and the TD groups, but post-training, there's really no discrimination. So they've pretty much normalized their response, not just in each individual region, which can be dependent on how you cluster and so on, but even in an unclustered setting across the whole brain. And moreover, brain plasticity predicts tutoring gains. So we can compute a distance metric for each individual, pre and post. How much did that brain change as a result of training? And we call this the brain plasticity index. And this index predicts performance gains. So it's a very distributed pattern that's changing, slightly different in each individual, but we're seeing normalization of brain response, and the degree of normalization actually predicts performance gains. So all the overactivation that children with MLD had during the task is now reduced and to very similar levels to the to the control group. So this approach could provide novel metrics, and it's obviously related to some of the broader goals in terms of broader implications of this work, that along multiple lines, we're able to derive metrics which will be useful for tracking and monitoring training and changes in strategy use. So I'm going to end with this, this study that's just coming out in the Journal of Neuroscience. So we so far have mostly focused on studies dealing with simple problem solving, arithmetic problem solving. But even prior to that, there are foundational numbers sense training gains, training that occurs in children. And so the question is the same kind of circuitry involved? So we developed a number sense training study to answer these questions. What are the circuit mechanisms that support number sense learning? Does the hippocampus have a broader role in number sense learning? And what are the essential circuits that might actually bind semantic information? So we have two pieces of information we need to bind, right, in number sense learning. So the idea that we have non-symbolic representations of quantity and we have symbolic representations of quantity. It's not very different from language studies, by the way, where you have to bridge the gap between a lexical representation or orthographic representation and a phonological representation. And I believe that when you have to integrate these two representations, types of representations in early stage, that's when the hippocampus kicks in to form new knowledge representations. So we know that from this body of work, and also very broad body of work in learning and memory, the hippocampus is involved in forming new representations, and the parietal cortex, obviously crucial for encoding information in space, which is something you need to do to map these dots. So, so we built a 4-week training study with working in collaboration with Lynn Fuchs and Vanderbilt. And we have neuropsych assessments, initial scanning, no contact control group. The training group goes through and is taught counting principles, relations between symbolic, and how to become more proficient. We have all kinds of games we developed. I don't have the time to go through that. The key thing is to build this mapping between these two representations. So we did everything we could to show and highlight these, and then you have to make judgments that go across these representations. And the training works, it improves skills. And then we looked at predictive circuits, again, focusing on the hippocampus. And we found that the hippocampus to parietal circuitry was highly predictive of learning gains, subsequent learning gains. This just shows data from the left and the right hemisphere. And this blue is the control group. So the next thing we did was to look at tracts, and we actually were able to map out these hippocampal parietal tracts. Been studied in younger children before. So it's a pathway that exists in our, and we can map it in our participants. But the key thing was that the structural integrity was not predictive of learning gains. It had something to do with the functional circuitry. That's something that we need to try and understand. But one of the things we did in the context of all of these studies that I've been showing you with the role of the medial temporal lobe and parietal circuitry was to see how broad this effect is in terms of learning and memory. So what we did here is working with Dan Wasserman in Paris was to use one of his tools called reverse meta-analysis of associations between co-activations in multiple areas and their links to cognitive functions. So the way this works is the neurosynth has data about brain areas that are activated in various tasks, and could be anything from attention to action or emotion. And then we have these cognitive terminologies, and we assess in a Bayesian formulation, what is the probability that this cognitive term appears given that there's coactivation of the left hippocampus and the left parietal cortex? And then for all the other pairs of combinations of the left and right. And we see that the only area that, the only term that kind of comes up across all of these four pathways is learning, retrieval, and recognition, and encoding. So this is, this bilateral circuitry is an essential circuit for learning and memory more broadly that had been missed in the prior literature very broadly. These are, this is accumulated across 14,000 fMRI studies. So we think, you know, we've really recapitulated one of the things that should have been known in the field all along, that learning in children relies on this essential circuit. And in this domain, the way I think it works very fundamentally is that you build knowledge representations from distinct domains, like non-symbolic to symbolic mapping is one that happens early on. And then you have other things that happen where you're using that knowledge to build retrieval fluency. And that's also a hippocampal memory system related process. And so here's the summary of this particular study. I mean, the key thing now for educational neuroscience more broadly is that we're able to develop these training studies which recapitulate development so that we don't have to look through things over multiple years. We can actually have effective training and intervention. And we've highlighted several core circuitries involving the hippocampus with the parietal cortex that's involved in very early stages of learning, and also the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, which scaffolds recall and efficient problem solving. So I've kind of come to a full circle where we've used systems approaches to understand what are the essential cognitive processes. And I just want to dissuade ourselves from the notion that there's one brain area that encodes all this and magically it comes online with development and then you have task proficiency. That's really not true at all. And then there are circuits that are formed and used at different stages of learning. And it's not random. There is a certain logic to this pathway that develops, and it involves engagement of the medial temporal lobe to form new associations and binding of new information. And it's observed across multiple domains of problem solving. And I've shown you how training studies can be used to probe individual differences and the circuits that drive learning in children with learning disabilities. And I just want to acknowledge the many individuals who have contributed to our work and also the funding agencies here. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take any and all questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Very interesting. Of course, it's my specialty is numerical cognition, so very interesting to listen to you. Thank you so much for your presentation. Before we begin Q&A, want to talk briefly about how they can interact with you. You can provide your questions in the Q&A box and we can respond to them for there. Or if you'd like to use the raise hand feature, and then we can call you to the stage to actually ask your question directly. I'll try and monitor both of those options and then facilitate the question and answer portion. So I see a couple of questions that are already in the Q&A area, as well as a couple of comments. Just give me one moment. I also see a question that's been typed into the chat from Dr. Eden. If you can move that question over into the Q&A, please. So first question, I'm going to try my best to actually sign the questions, so please forgive me if I missign them. So a question about how this research is different, especially with deaf children who usually learn in visual ways. Do you think you can apply this same methodology regardless of whether the children are hearing or deaf?
So I think most of these things hold. The work that I described, it was not specifically related to verbal codes. But if you were to map, the symbol 2 to the phonological representation, then you would have a bottleneck there in this case. But most of this learning that I've described is very visual. But in our training studies, we've actually not just fully automated this visual learning process. We actually had multiple points where the tutor would actually ask the child, how did you learn? Did you understand this? And probe them to see, what is the next lesson plan that the child should be engaged with. Now, all of that can be done with individuals who might be deaf as well. But through a different communication medium. Now, there's one piece of the code which is also important in building semantic representations, right? The phonological code. The more types of code you add, the deeper the semantic representations you build. And so I think there will be a line of missing representations that could make the information more semantic. And so, that's my general reading of the relationship between perceptual and semantic. So if you're missing specific perceptual components, the semantic representations, and I'm not necessarily saying that they might be weakened, but they would have to be strengthened in other ways. So I think that's one principle to keep in mind. But fundamentally, most of these things, through visual learning, they are, the principles are similar. The parietal cortex presumably has very similar organization, the hippocampal formation as well. But this is one pathway that links and embeds the auditory phonological system that's impacted. And I think we've not done a good job of studying those individuals, and maybe Ilaria is pioneering some of this work, where you are. And so it's critical to understand, what happens to individuals. And it's also quite interesting from a neurobiological perspective, because the knowledge can then be used in many other domains to inform learning.
Yes, and recently some work has been done in my lab. I have a graduate student who has worked on an fMRI study with deaf adults who acquired sign language early, so all fluent signers. And what we see is that the left IFG activates while solving mathematical problems, exactly in the same regions that we see in hearing adults, where they're doing retrieval for mathematic problems. So it completely, regardless of language, you're still going to see it stored. The sign phonology area isn't language specific.
That's interesting.
So our next question is from Dr. Eden. So is the hippocampus IPS circuitry critical to learning and memory for numerical cognition only, or also for other skills, such as reading, for example?
Yeah, hi, Guinevere. Thanks for attending, and thanks for asking this interesting question. So, the meta-analysis I showed, that's very broad across all fMRI studies, showing that the hippocampal parietal link is one of the links that comes up most commonly in relationship and is predictive of learning. But the number of training studies have been so few. In the context of learning, and in adults learning new languages, is kind of where I would predict there would be a very similar kind of circuitry. Although I don't think it would be the hippocampus to IPS. It might be hippocampus to a phonological processing area, or the ventral stream word form type of area that are involved in forming those type of phonological and orthographic representations. So I mean, it also depends on the developmental stage. So in one study recently, we showed that the parietal circuitry with the word form area is involved in language function too. So because you have to read letters across space. And so at the early stages, you're going to see the involvement of the parietal attentional system as well. But I think the fundamental circuit there is going to be more hippocampus. And they have been with the word form, the kind of the perceptual representation. In the context of numerical cognition, that perceptual representation occurs in two places. One is, at the level of just the form in the ventral stream, and then the more semantic aspects related to spatial attention, which is kind of the visual spatial scaffold for all numerical information processing. So it remains to be seen. I've seen a few studies on the role of the hippocampus turning on during on reading, learning to read. Now, developmentally, that happens at a much earlier age compared to the second and third grade that we've studied here, or even the first grade with the number sense training. So if we were to probe this earlier in development with language and basic reading, I think we would see and tap into that role. But since most of the studies happen much later with fMRI, that crucial piece of information may be still missing in the literature, actually.
Thank you. I think it's really challenging to scan children in their 2s, 3s, and 4s, right, when they're first starting to acquire those letter word connections and associations.
Right.
So I don't know who actually wants to try and scan in that age range. Another question from one of our students, and I think it has a more closer relationship to what you've talked about. Their question is about the results of your study. Have you considered using manipulatives as for retrieval or calculation? Do you think that would change how the neural network functions? Like if you found a way to lighten the load of working memory?
So manipulatives, you mean like spatial manipulatives? Objects and things like that. Yeah. So we've actually used it in our training studies, formed an essential part so that they would build a sense of space. And maybe that's why we captured a hippocampal parietal circuit, because actually it wasn't just, basic numerosity to number form coding. There were a bunch of things that people had to learn on the spatial side, that is not spatially, but spatial mapping to the representations to build a rich learning experience. But it's a little bit harder to do in the scanner, particularly with kids, with physical manipulatives, and assess that. But I think experimentally it can be done. You could just randomize individuals into one group or the other, and then probe what happens in one group or the other. So we haven't done that, but it's an interesting question.
Thank you. Next, I see a longer question from Dr. Pizzi. I'm not going to try and sign that whole question. So either Dr. Pizzi can come on screen herself, or I'll read it and ask our interpreter to sign it for me. Let's see if Dr. Pizzi wants to come on screen. Okay, she does not have her camera available, so I'm going to go ahead and read the question in English.
Okay, so these studies utilizing tutoring interventions are very interesting and important. It's amazing to see how much one-on-one attention and learning development has such a clear impact on brain structure, function, and behavior. However, thinking about educational settings, as much as I would love to think about giving a private tutor to each and every student, it doesn't seem like that kind of intervention provides a scalable solution. If you had to recommend how we would translate this kind of tutor intervention to an educational setting, what would you recommend? What aspect of this intervention do you think would make the largest impact in trying to scale to a broader education system?
Well, it's not completely clear to me that these elements of learning that we implemented are not part of the standard protocol. I think what might be missing is the one-to-one attention that we're able to devote. So I think the essential part of it is to build links between different perceptual pieces that build then result in a semantic representation. So taking different aspects of, somebody raised the question of manipulators. So we use this because we wanted to build another level of representations. That is not just one way of thinking of something, you can actually do things with it and then make that link. And now we haven't done control studies to say what happens with and without this, but I think in practice, the strategy would be to, I mean, if you just go with the hippocampal learning kind of story, what does the hippocampus do? It binds new kinds of information. So if you can bind more and more different types of information to create semantic representations, then it becomes very generalizable. It's not tied to, and that's kind of the thing you need for mathematical cognition, right? You're not going back and counting two objects. You have an abstract sense of the two, then you develop the next skill. And then the number two is now, translated from two objects to two dimensions. You have graphs, you have the next level. So at each level, you're developing a sense of abstraction. And I think the only way to develop the sense of abstraction is to build multiple perceptual representations that then the individual, and this is what the hippocampus does so beautifully, is actually to make them, to bind them in a way that with other brain areas, it becomes much more semantic-like. And that's at the highest level, that's what you need. But even at the elementary level, skill level of just very simple fluid problem solving, I think that's, that's probably what, as much as these type of studies can inform. But I think the broader question of, why there's so much, deficit in this basic number sense and how it cascades out, I think it has more to do with the practicalities of the educational system rather than, fundamentals that are actually missing.
So I also have a question, but I will talk for this one. It's still building in my head, so I'm not sure how I'm going to explain it clearly. You've shown results where there's improvement and neural changes for children with math learning disability. In my head, math learning disability is a persistent disability that does not resolve, that continues through adulthood. The severe cases, but even probably the more moderate cases continue to persist. However, you've seen some changes there. So what is it really? Is it that there is a temporary change, a temporary improvement, and then somehow it does not remain and it doesn't remain acquired, like until I'm taking the pill, I'm better. As soon as I remove the pill, I feel sick again? Or is it that those kids were just low achievers for some reasons, and they just now are brought to the level of peers because they've received more adequate teaching and training and explanations? Because there are some problems that even, what is correlated is some problems like what we call large facts that we keep on struggling, no matter how many times we've repeated them. If we come up to someone 6 times 7, the first reaction is, wait, oh yes. For a lot of people, regardless whether they've had or haven't had math learning disability in their past. So what is it with these two situations? I feel they're related, yet they're distinct. One is math learning disability that seems to provide some improvement and then is technically persistent. And then why are some problems so hard to become memorized in long-term memory when we've seen them as many times as we've seen the other ones, and we've trained them, and we've maybe had periods where we knew them without having to calculate, and then for some reason we have to fall back on backup strategies. What are your thoughts about these two issues?
It's a very, deep and complex question. In the training studies we've done, I mean, those are the ones that I can speak to, we see normalization pretty interestingly. So we have to keep in mind that this is normal IQ, specific learning disability, reading is normal, not comorbid ADHD. And these individuals may show a very different profile from the canonical examples that you're giving. So isolating the subtypes in terms of overall intellectual disability, which is fairly easy to do. And I think you want to have a strategy for those individuals, which I think will be quite effective. And we have the tools to improve learning in them. We haven't tracked individuals longitudinally in our study, but I think the fact that things normalize so quickly, both in terms of behavior and brain responses, should be encouraging. Now, there's an entirely different group of people, and I'm not even talking about the 3 to 5% in the Brian Butterworth sense, Butterworth sense, who has really put the basic number sense parietal deficit as the core anchoring deficit. And those appear only in 3 to 5% of the cases from what we can see. In the samples we've looked at, the number sense generally tends to be quite normal. And it's really the fluency which is a bigger challenge. So if you move away from that core deficit individuals, and you move away from broader learning disabilities and intellectual disabilities, I think that's where we can be actually quite hopeful of moving the needle, because I think we have the tools. Maybe it's motivation, maybe it's anxiety, maybe it's other factors, but it's not an intellectual deficit because they're able to learn other things. And so in this narrow but important regime, we can actually implement changes with the tools that we have. Now, the individuals with ADHD, for example, which is highly comorbid with all learning disabilities, I think the challenge might be addressed in a different way. That in some sense, you have to treat the ADHD aspects and then bring maybe these same machineries can work. Now, in terms of individuals, the other subtype with intellectual disabilities, I think that's where the challenge is the most significant. And I don't think I have a good answer on how to move the needle on that front. We haven't really probed those individuals. They're harder to study for a number of different reasons. And that's where we may see actually more protracted deficits despite multiple interventions.
Yes, definitely touch on a point that Dr. Pizzi will agree. It's the anxiety of math that is so prevalent. And I'm not sure, I'm thinking a little bit out loud, but it seems like there's a lot of emphasis on math anxiety here in the US compared to other countries. And can that alone backfire? The fact that we are so aware that there's math anxiety, that we're actually creating math anxiety, because it's something that I feel is less maybe known. I don't know, I don't have stats, cross-country stats to see if it is, but there's definitely countries where math performance is higher. And here in the US, there's everything for being very advanced in math and having higher performances when you compare them across countries. There's there's everything in the schools, and most of the schools have more than probably 2/3 of the world. And yet there's these values that are so low. And I wonder whether math anxiety is one component. Maybe the society puts so much pressure on it. And the other thing is, I have kids in school and I observe what happens. And I'm like, why don't they do more repetition? There's a lot of emphasis, which I agree with, on providing different strategies, providing different approaches to contextualize, to not limit a child to a single rule or a single strategy that is maybe void of meaning. And so they present lines, and they present cubes, and they present numbers and dots and manipulatives, whatever they can think of. And it's great. But at some point, I feel that there's no repetition. There is no opportunity to integrate any of these strategies, which means that if the child forgets the meaning and the reasoning behind, they're left with nothing, not even a strategy void of meaning. Not even the rules are automated, which means that sometimes I don't remember, but I know the rule and I will do the rule. And then because I'm older, because I've learned more, and I will rebuild what's behind my rule, right? So I wonder whether this kind of lines with what you were saying. There's a lot of hours of math in school in the US. There's 1 hour every day. A lot of the curriculum in other countries don't have an hour of math per day. I've compared at least 2 or 3 countries, and yet the levels don't match up. What do you think about this? This is a little bit more our translational question, our translational talk.
Yeah, no, I'm glad we're discussing this, because it wasn't a part of the core scientific presentation, but these are obviously important things in terms of the broader impact of our work. So math anxiety has a neurobiological basis. We actually published a study in Journal of Neuroscience several years back with as we might expect, it shows up in the amygdala. So it's very real biologically. Cognitive training can reduce effects of math anxiety, as we've shown that in another study. So, and Sean Bailoch has done a number of has published a study looking at math anxiety globally. And from what I can recall at this point, I don't think there was very strong evidence that math anxiety was significantly elevated in the US, although we think that it is, and it's it's at least anecdotally. But it's worth looking at those numbers again. But certainly there's a fairly high levels of math anxiety in other cultures as well, in other countries as well. I think math anxiety is a big factor in reduced motivation to learn in the domain. And because people think or have thought that it's not as crucial as reading, certainly reading is absolutely essential. It's been one of those things, okay, so I'm anxious, I'm not going to pursue this. I'm going to avoid it. That's the hallmark of anxiety. And because it's not part of this, the spoken language, you're not talking numerical cognition. Most of the time you're talking kind of social interaction with language. So that aspect is more fluid, I guess. But this is a domain where you have to learn information, and there's also pressures of learning. And that's just built this feedback cycle of anxiety. So how to reduce that, I have no idea. But I think it's just a lot of cultural issues that probably I'm not well equipped to address that at this point. But there's a second piece to your question, right? Why the US? Yeah, and that's really hard. And that may be a very big challenge to cross to.
I agree. It's really big, important challenge. Mm-hmm. Okay, I think I will thank you so much. It's already 3:30 now. Thank you for coming, for your amazing presentation. I think we had a really amazing audience come. Turnout was wonderful. I will need to transition to ASL. I can't syncom. I can't.
Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Manan, for your fantastic presentation. We look forward to you being able to come and visit in person, maybe in the next couple of years. We would love to have the opportunity to interact with you here and show you our labs. And we look forward to continuing this discussion in terms of research around language and math and looking at deaf and hearing people and their numerical cognition. We are going to close the webinar shortly. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Enjoyed being with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you, interpreters, also. Thank you so much.